He stood in line like any proud father, but two young guards saw only his skin, not his sacrifice. Moments later, 5 retired SEALs walked in, and the entire room fell silent. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The polished oak doors of the Thornton Academy auditorium gleamed under the bright June morning sun, reflecting the anxious, excited faces of parents arriving for the graduation ceremony. Master Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Gunny Johnson, retired, stood a little apart from the main throng, his posture erect despite the slight ache in his left knee, a memento from a Fallujah rooftop decades ago. He clutched a small, neatly wrapped gift for his son, Ethan, his calloused hand surprisingly gentle. Today was a monumental day. Ethan, his only child, was graduating as valedictorian, a culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice, not just by Ethan, but by Marcus too, who had raised him single-handedly after losing his beloved Sarah. He wore a simple, well-pressed navy blue suit, a tie knotted with military precision. His shoes shined to a mirror finish. He wasn't one for ostentation, but today, he wanted to look his best for Ethan. He approached the main entrance, where 2 security guards in crisp, Academy-issued blazers were checking invitations. They were young, barely older than Ethan, with an air of self-importance that often accompanied new uniforms and a little authority. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. He offered his invitation, a gold embossed card bearing Ethan's name and his own as invited guest. The first guard, a thin young man with a name tag reading Miller, barely glanced at it. His eyes flickered over Marcus, from his dark skin to his neatly trimmed but graying hair, lingering for a moment on a faint scar that traced along Marcus's temple. "Hold on a minute," Miller said, his tone dismissive. He nudged his partner, a heavier-set guard named Henderson. "Take a look at this." Henderson ambled over, chewing gum with an open mouth. He took the invitation from Marcus, turned it over, then looked Marcus up and down with an expression that bordered on insolence. "Name?" Henderson grunted. "Marcus Johnson," Marcus replied, keeping his voice even, though a familiar knot of frustration began to tighten in his chest. He'd faced this kind of scrutiny before, in countless situations where his appearance seemed to invite suspicion rather than acceptance. "Invitation says, Master Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Johnson," Miller interjected, a sneer in his voice. "You a Master Gunny?" He looked at Marcus's civilian suit as if it were an affront. Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Retired," he said quietly. "United States Marine Corps." Henderson chuckled, a short, unpleasant sound. "Right, and I'm the commandant." "Look, sir," he said, the "sir" an insult in its delivery, "we have a list. And your name, Marcus Johnson, isn't on our primary guest list for special seating. Valedictorian's father should be on that list." "My son is Ethan Johnson, the valedictorian," Marcus explained patiently. "This is his invitation. Perhaps there's a mistake with your list?" Miller shook his head. "No mistake on our end, pal. List is the list. You can wait over there." He gestured vaguely toward a roped-off area some distance away. "And if there's space after all the priority guests are seated, maybe we can let you in. Can't make any promises." The humiliation was a sudden, cold weight. To be treated like an interloper, a potential troublemaker, at his own son's graduation, the proudest day of his life. He thought of the years of scrimping and saving, the extra shifts he'd pulled after retiring from the Corps to afford Thornton's tuition, the late nights helping Ethan with homework, the quiet pride he felt watching his son grow into such a fine young man. And now this. 2 young guards, full of their own petty power, barring his way. He saw other parents, mostly white, immaculately dressed, breezing past with polite nods from the guards, their invitations barely inspected. The contrast was a bitter pill. He took a deep breath, fighting back the surge of anger, the old warrior's instinct to meet aggression with overwhelming force. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was Ethan's day. He wouldn't mar it with a confrontation. "There must be some misunderstanding," Marcus said again, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Could you please check again? Or perhaps call one of the school administrators." Henderson leaned back, crossing his arms. "Look, we're busy. We got our orders. No name, no entry to the priority section. You could try general admission later if you behave. The condescension was palpable. Marcus felt the eyes of other parents on him, a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. He stood there, a decorated veteran, a father filled with pride, reduced to a nameless, suspect figure by two young men in ill-fitting blazers. Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened. The injustice of it was a sharp, metallic taste in Marcus's mouth. He had faced down enemy fire, led men through hell and back, endured hardships that would make these young guards crumble. Yet here he was, on one of the most important days of his life, being treated like a trespasser. The knot in Marcus's chest tightened. He was a man of immense discipline, his entire adult life forged in the crucible of the Marine Corps, where respect was earned and orders, when legitimate, were followed. But this felt like neither. This felt like a deliberate slight, a casual dismissal of his dignity. Young men, Marcus began, his voice low and steady, a tone that had once commanded the attention of hundreds of battle-hardened Marines. I assure you, I am Ethan Johnson's father. This invitation is valid. I would appreciate it if you would simply verify my identity with a school official. I am certain this can be cleared up quickly. Miller rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. Yeah, everyone's got a story. We've heard them all. My son's the quarterback. My daughter's the head cheerleader. Rules are rules. No special treatment. Henderson chimed in, his voice laced with a smug superiority. Look, Pops, maybe you should have called ahead if you thought you were someone important. Thornton Academy has standards. We can't just let anyone wander into the VIP seating. The word Pops grated on Marcus's nerves, a disrespectful diminutive that underscored their contempt. He thought of the sacrifices he'd made, the years he'd poured into ensuring Ethan could attend a place like Thornton, a place that supposedly prided itself on excellence and integrity. And these were its gatekeepers? He saw Mrs. Albright, a prominent local businesswoman whose son was also graduating, sweet past. She gave Marcus a cursory, dismissive glance as Henderson and Miller waved her through with obsequious smiles. The double standard was blatant, a stark reminder of unspoken biases that still permeated even supposedly enlightened institutions. Marcus pulled out his wallet, a worn leather affair that had seen him through 3 tours of duty. He extracted his retired military ID, the gold eagle, globe, and anchor of the Marine Corps emblem clearly visible. This is my official United States Marine Corps retired identification card. Master Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Johnson. It matches the name on the invitation. Will this suffice? Miller took the card, his eyes widening slightly as he registered the rank. Master Gunnery Sergeant was the highest enlisted rank in the Corps, a position of immense respect and responsibility. For a moment, Marcus thought he saw a flicker of doubt in the young guard's eyes. But Henderson, perhaps feeling his authority challenged, quickly intervened. He snatched the ID from Miller's hand. Military ID? What's it got to do with a school graduation? This isn't a base, you know. And frankly, he leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially, but loud enough for Marcus to hear clearly. Anyone can get one of those things made up these days. We need to see you on our list. Period. The implication was clear. They didn't believe him. They thought he was a fraud, perhaps try to gate-crash an exclusive event. The insult was profound. Marcus's hand clenched into a fist at his side. A lifetime of discipline, the only thing keeping him from reacting in a way he would later regret. He took a slow, calming breath. I understand you have procedures, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. But your procedure is currently preventing me from seeing my son graduate as valedictorian. I am asking you, respectfully, to find a supervisor, to make a phone call, to perform the due diligence your position requires beyond simply staring at a flawed list. A small crowd was beginning to gather, curious onlookers drawn by the hushed but intense confrontation. Marcus felt their stares, the weight of their silent judgment. He hated being the center of such negative attention, especially here, especially today. He wanted this to be about Ethan, about his son's triumph, not about his own humiliation. Henderson seemed to puff up with importance at being the center of a minor drama. "Are you questioning our competence, sir?" he asked, the sir now laden with sarcasm. "Because if you are, that's a different problem. Maybe you're the one who needs to speak to a supervisor about disturbing the peace." The threat was thinly veiled. They were trying to intimidate him into backing down, into accepting their arbitrary decision. Marcus looked past them, towards the grand entrance of the auditorium, hearing the distant strains of the school orchestra tuning up. Ethan would be in there, nervous, excited, probably wondering where his father was. The thought spurred him on. He couldn't let these two petty tyrants rob him of this moment, rob Ethan of having his father there. "I am not disturbing the peace," Marcus stated, his voice like chilled steel. "I am a father attempting to attend his son's graduation, and I will not be turned away by incompetence or prejudice." The word prejudice hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. Miller flushed, and Henderson's eyes narrowed into slits. This was escalating, and Marcus knew it, but he had reached a point where backing down felt like a betrayal of himself, of Ethan, of every principle he had ever stood for. Inside the vast, ornate auditorium of Thornton Academy, Ethan Johnson adjusted his valedictorian sash, his heart a nervous drum against his ribs. He scanned the rows of assembled parents, faculty, and students, searching for one familiar, reassuring face. His father wasn't in their assigned seats, prime spots near the front reserved for the families of honor students. A frown creased Ethan's brow. His dad was never late, especially not for something this important. Punctuality was practically a religion for the retired master gunnery sergeant. He'd probably just gotten caught in traffic, Ethan told himself, though a small worm of unease began to wriggle in his stomach. His father had been so excited, so proud. They talked about this day for years. Ethan remembered his father sitting with him at the kitchen table late into the night, patiently explaining complex math problems or proofreading essays, his presence a steady, unwavering source of support. Marcus hadn't had an easy life. He joined the Marines young, seeking discipline and direction, and found a calling. He'd served with distinction, seen things no one should ever have to see, lost friends, endured hardships. And through it all, his love for Ethan, and for Ethan's late mother, Sarah, had been his anchor. After Sarah passed, Marcus had become both father and mother, a difficult balancing act for a man used to the rigid structures of military life. But he'd done it with a quiet strength and a fierce, protective love that Ethan sometimes felt he didn't deserve. Thornton Academy had been a huge financial stretch. Marcus had worked 2, sometimes 3, part-time security jobs after his retirement to make it happen, always insisting that Ethan deserved the best education possible. "You've got the brains, son," Marcus would say, ruffling Ethan's hair. "My job is to make sure you have the opportunity to use them." And Ethan had worked hard, driven by a desire to make his father proud, to validate those sacrifices. Today, as valedictorian, he felt he had finally achieved that. His speech was tucked into his gown pocket, its words carefully chosen to express his gratitude, especially to his father. He imagined his dad's proud smile, the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners, maybe even a rare tear that he'd quickly brush away. The thought made Ethan smile. But where was he? The orchestra struck up the processional march. Students began to file into their seats. The unease in Ethan's stomach grew. Back outside, Marcus was acutely aware of the passing time. The music was a clear signal that the ceremony was about to begin. The thought of Ethan looking for him, of his son standing up to give his speech without his father in the audience, was a fresh stab of pain, more potent than any personal insult the guards could hurl. "Please," Marcus said, his voice losing some of its steely edge, replaced by a note of raw urgency. "The ceremony is starting. My son will be looking for me. Isn't there anyone, a teacher, an administrator, anyone you can call?" Henderson smirked. "Should have thought of that before you showed up without being on the list, shouldn't you? Maybe your son forgot to invite you properly." The cruelty of that remark, the implication that Ethan was somehow at fault or that Marcus wasn't truly wanted, was a low blow. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, drawing on reserves of patience he didn't know he possessed. He pictured Ethan's face, his bright, intelligent eyes, the way he'd looked up to him as a child, full of unquestioning love and admiration. He had to get in there. He couldn't fail him. Not today. He decided on a different tack. "All right," he said, forcing a calmer tone. "Perhaps I can speak to the head of security. Or the principal, Dr. Abernathy. I met him briefly at a parent-teacher conference last year. I'm sure he would remember me." Miller scoffed. "Dr. Abernathy? He's a very busy man. He doesn't have time to deal with every Tom, Dick, and Harry who thinks they're entitled to special treatment." Marcus felt a flicker of desperation. He was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare, at the mercy of two young men who clearly relished their small measure of power and were either unwilling or unable to apply common sense or decency. He thought of the times he'd faced down far greater threats, of making life-or-death decisions in fractions of a second. And now, he was stymied by a clipboard and a bad attitude. The irony was not lost on him. The weight of his responsibility to Ethan, the burning injustice of the situation, and the ticking clock of the approaching ceremony pressed down on him, a suffocating burden. Marcus remembered a piece of advice an old mentor, a grizzled first sergeant from his early days in the Corps, had once given him. "When you hit a brick wall, son, don't just keep banging your head against it. Look for a door, a window, or if you have to, find a way to go over or around." He scanned the area. The main entrance was clearly a lost cause with Miller and Henderson guarding it like Cerberus. Were there other entrances? Perhaps a side door? Or a staff entrance he could try? But that would involve slipping away, acting furtively, which could be misconstrued and potentially create an even bigger problem if he were caught. It might also mean he'd miss Ethan's procession or his speech if he didn't find a seat in time. No, he needed to resolve this here at the main point of entry, but he needed a different approach. He recalled his brief service in embassy security detail between combat tours. It was a different kind of warfare, one of protocol, diplomacy, and understanding chains of command. He remembered dealing with officious local guards at foreign posts, learning how to navigate their sense of self-importance without causing an international incident. Sometimes, it wasn't about confrontation, but about finding the right lever. "All right, gentlemen," Marcus said, his tone shifting again, becoming less confrontational, more resigned, though his eyes still held a spark of determination. "I understand you have a job to do, and I'm not trying to make it difficult. But this is extremely important to me and to my son. Is there a senior security supervisor on duty today? Perhaps I could speak with them directly. They might have a more comprehensive list or the authority to make an exception if an error has occurred." Miller and Henderson exchanged a look. This was a more reasonable request, one harder to dismiss out of hand without appearing completely obstructive. Henderson grunted. "Sergeant Davies is the shift supervisor, but he's busy coordinating security for the whole event. I would be happy to wait until he has a moment," Marcus said patiently. "If you could just radio him and explain the situation. Father of the valedictorian, invitation in hand, name inexplicably missing from your list. I'm sure he'd want to resolve it." He was banking on the hope that a more experienced supervisor would have better judgment and access to more accurate information. As he spoke, Marcus's mind briefly flashed back to a dusty outpost in Anbar province. He'd been a staff sergeant then, leading a patrol that had been ambushed. They were pinned down, taking heavy fire, communication spotty. Two of his young Marines were wounded. He remembered the desperate need to think clearly, to find a way out, to protect his men. He'd had to make a call then, a risky maneuver that involved flanking the enemy position through a narrow, exposed alleyway. It had worked, but it had been terrifying. This situation was different, of course. No lives were on the line, but the feeling of being trapped, of needing to find a solution against obstinate resistance, felt uncomfortably familiar. The quiet strength he had drawn upon then, he tried to summon now. He focused on Ethan, on the pride in his son's achievement, using it as an anchor against the rising tide of frustration. He wouldn't let this minor injustice overshadow the monumental achievement of his son. He had to believe that reason and decency would eventually prevail. Henderson, after a moment's consideration, unclipped his radio. "All right, fine," he grumbled, "but don't get your hopes up." Davies doesn't like his routine interrupted. He spoke into the radio, his voice still carrying a hint of his earlier arrogance, but also a new note of caution, perhaps realizing that stonewalling a potentially legitimate guest of honor might have repercussions. Marcus waited, his heart a little lighter. This was progress, however small. He just hoped Sergeant Davies was a man of reason. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The sounds from the auditorium grew louder. The orchestra was now playing a prelude, the murmur of the assembled crowd a low hum. Ethan would be lining up with the other graduates, his moment approaching fast. Marcus clenched and unclenched his fists, trying to remain calm, trying to project an air of patient expectation rather than the simmering anger he still felt. He prayed this supervisor would be the key, the way around this unforeseen, unnecessary brick wall. Sergeant Davies, the security supervisor, finally arrived nearly 10 minutes later, his expression harried. He was an older man, probably ex-military himself, given his bearing, but his face was etched with the weariness of someone dealing with logistical headaches on a major event day. Henderson quickly recounted his version of events, emphasizing Marcus's persistence and their adherence to protocol. Marcus listened patiently. Then, when Davies turned to him, he calmly and concisely explained his situation, presenting his invitation and his retired military ID. "My son is Ethan Johnson, the valedictorian, Sergeant Davies," Marcus concluded. "I simply wish to be there to see him graduate. This is his invitation. My name is on it." Davies examined the invitation, then the ID, his brow furrowed. He looked at Marcus a long, appraising look. Unlike his subordinates, there was no immediate dismissal in his eyes, but rather a careful consideration. "Master Gunnery Sergeant, retired," Davies said, nodding slowly as he read the ID. "That's a hell of a career, Gunny." He handed the ID back. "The list we were given by the administration office for priority seating is, well, let's just say it's had a few revisions. It's possible there was an oversight." This was the first glimmer of real hope Marcus had felt. Davies seemed like a reasonable man. "However," Davies continued, his tone becoming more regretful, "the auditorium is now a capacity for reserved seating. The doors are closed for the procession. Even if I wanted to, I can't get you into that section now without causing a major disruption. Protocol is protocol once the doors are sealed for procession." Marcus's heart sank. So close, yet still so far. The orchestra inside swelled, playing the unmistakable strains of pomp and circumstance. The graduates were marching. Ethan was marching, and he was stuck out here. "But," Davies said, seeing the profound disappointment on Marcus's face, "there's a small overflow viewing room. It has a live video feed of the ceremony. It's not ideal, I know, but it's the best I can offer at this late stage. You'll be able to see and hear everything, and I'll personally escort you there." It was a compromise, a deeply unsatisfying one, but it was something. At least he wouldn't miss seeing Ethan, even if it was on a screen, even if he wasn't there in person to share that triumphant moment in the same room. The thought of Ethan not seeing him in the audience, not knowing his father was there at all, was still a painful one. "Thank you, Sergeant Davies," Marcus said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I appreciate your effort," as Davies led Marcus towards a side entrance, away from the disapproving glares of Miller and Henderson, who looked somewhat deflated that their authority hadn't been fully upheld. Marcus felt a profound sense of failure. He had fought battles, overcome incredible odds, and yet he couldn't even navigate the bureaucracy of a high school graduation to be there for his son in the way he'd envisioned. The overflow room was small, utilitarian, with a few rows of plastic chairs and a large television screen showing the live feed from the auditorium. A handful of latecomers and staff members were already there. Marcus took a seat in the back, the wrapped gift for Ethan resting on his lap. On the screen, he saw Ethan, tall and handsome in his graduation gown, walking proudly in the procession. A lump formed in Marcus's throat. His son, valedictorian. He should be in there, sharing that electric atmosphere, feeling the pride radiate through the crowd. Instead, he was here, in this sterile little room, watching a televised version of one of the most important moments of his son's life. The principal, Dr. Abernathy, was now at the podium, welcoming the attendees. His voice boomed through the speakers, full of platitudes about achievement and bright futures. Marcus barely heard him. His gaze was fixed on Ethan, who was now seated on the stage with the other honor students. Ethan scanned the audience, his brow furrowed, a fleeting expression of worry crossing his face. He was looking for him, and Marcus wasn't there. The pain of that realization was a physical ache. He had let his son down. Suddenly, a commotion at the main entrance of the auditorium, visible on the edge of the television screen, caught his attention. The live feed camera didn't pan over, but Marcus could hear a shift in the ambient sound from the auditorium, a ripple of surprise, then a sudden, profound silence that cut through Dr. Abernathy's speech mid-sentence. Dr. Abernathy himself looked up, startled, towards the back of the auditorium. What was happening? Even in the overflow room, the few people present looked at each other, puzzled. Then, the main doors of the overflow room burst open. Standing in the doorway of the small overflow room were 5 men. Not just any men. These were figures of an entirely different caliber than the Academy Guards. They were tall, lean, exuding an aura of quiet, coiled power that instantly commanded the attention of everyone present. They wore civilian clothes, smart, understated suits and collared shirts, but there was no mistaking their bearing. It was the unmistakable presence of elite special operators. Their eyes, sharp and assessing, swept the room before a dimity. The worn plastic spoon scraped the bottom of the yogurt container with a familiar, hollow sound. Amelia sighed, not in frustration, but in a quiet acknowledgement of another day beginning just like the last. For 7 years, this had been part of her pre-dawn ritual. Prepare a small, nourishing breakfast, not just for herself, but for Mr. Henderson, the silent man who occupied the same weathered bench in Elmwood Park. She never called him by his first name, though she'd learned it was Thomas from a discarded library card she'd once found near his usual spot. He was always just Mr. Henderson, a fixture in her life as immutable as the sunrise. She packed the yogurt, a banana, and a small bottle of water into a paper bag, adding a folded napkin. Outside, the city was still draped in the cool, gray light of early morning. As she walked the 3 blocks to the park, the air crisp against her cheeks, she saw Mrs. Gable from apartment 3B, already walking her yapping terrier. The older woman nodded curtly, her gaze flicking to the paper bag in Amelia's hand and then away, a subtle disapproval that Amelia had grown accustomed to. It was the same look she received from others. The well-meaning friends who suggested she donate to a shelter instead, the colleagues who implied her efforts were a waste of time, even her own mother who worried about her safety. Still feeding that vagrant? Mrs. Gable had asked once, her voice laced with a pity that felt more like condescension. There are services for people like him, dear. You shouldn't encourage it. Amelia had merely smiled and continued on her way. How could she explain the unspoken understanding she felt with Mr. Henderson, the quiet dignity in his eyes, the way he always nodded his thanks, never asking for more, never expecting anything? How could she articulate that this small act was as much for her as it was for him, a daily anchor of simple, unadulterated kindness in a world that often felt too complicated? He was there, as always, huddled in his oversized, threadbare coat, even though the spring mornings were growing milder. His silver hair was matted, his beard unkempt, but his posture, even in sleep, held a certain rigidity, a discipline that seemed out of place with his circumstances. Amelia approached quietly, placing the bag beside him on the bench. He stirred, his eyes opening slowly, clearing with a practiced speed that always surprised her. He looked at the bag, then at Amelia, and gave his customary nod. No words were ever exchanged beyond a murmured good morning from her. Yet, in that shared silence, a bond had formed, fragile yet resilient, woven from countless sunrises and small paper bags. As she turned to leave, a younger man jogging past paused, his expensive headphones pushed back. He looked from Mr. Henderson to Amelia, a smirk playing on his lips. "You know," he said, his voice loud in the quiet park, You're probably just enabling him. He'll never get off the streets if people keep giving him handouts. Amelia felt a familiar flush creep up her neck, but she met his gaze evenly. Perhaps, she said softly, but today he won't be hungry. The jogger snorted and resumed his run, shaking his head. Amelia watched him go, the judgment stinging less than it used to. She didn't do this for approval, or to solve the vast complexities of homelessness. She did it because it felt right, because Mr. Henderson was a human being who deserved to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be offered a moment of care. What the jogger, Mrs. Gable, and so many others didn't know, couldn't possibly comprehend, was the depth of the story that lay hidden beneath Mr. Henderson's ragged exterior, or the extraordinary way this simple, 7-year ritual was about to intersect with a future Amelia couldn't yet imagine, a future involving vows, a white dress, and an astonishing display of honor that would leave an entire town speechless. Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened. Amelia continued her walk to the small bakery, where she worked, the scent of yeast and sugar a comforting embrace. The encounter in the park, though brief, lingered in her thoughts. It wasn't the first time she'd faced criticism, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Her fiancé, David, a kind and pragmatic architect, often worried. "I just don't want you to get hurt, Leah," he'd say, his brow furrowed. "You don't know anything about him. What if he's dangerous?" She understood his concern, truly she did. But Mr. Henderson had never shown anything but quiet gratitude. There was a profound sadness in his eyes, yes, but no menace. She'd once seen him gently move a stray kitten from the path of an oncoming bicycle, his large, calloused hand surprisingly tender. That single act had solidified her conviction that beneath the layers of hardship was a good man. The wedding plans were in full swing, a joyful chaos that consumed most of her free time. Invitations had been sent, the venue booked, her dress carefully chosen. It was a simple, elegant affair they were planning, a reflection of their own personalities. Amidst the flurry of decisions about floral arrangements and seating charts, her morning ritual with Mr. Henderson remained a constant, a quiet counterpoint to the mounting excitement. Sometimes, as she sat addressing envelopes or discussing cake flavors with David, her mind would drift to the man on the park bench. She wondered about his life before, what series of misfortunes had led him to this point. Had he ever been married? Did he have children? There were no clues, only the guarded sorrow in his gaze and the military precision with which he folded the empty paper bag each day before tucking it into his coat pocket. This particular detail always struck her, the neatness, the order in such a disordered existence. It hinted at a past discipline, a life where things had their place. Occasionally, she would leave an old paperback novel with his breakfast, something she'd enjoyed, and the next day it would be gone, replaced by the neatly folded bag. He never commented, but she liked to imagine him reading, escaping for a few hours into another world. The judgment from others, however, began to escalate subtly as the wedding approached. David's mother, a well-intentioned but rather socially conscious woman, had once driven past the park as Amelia was leaving the bag. Later, over tea, she delicately inquired, "Amelia, dear, I know your heart is in the right place, but perhaps it's time to redirect your charitable efforts? Especially now with the wedding. People do talk." The implication was clear. Her association with a homeless man might reflect poorly on their family. Amelia had felt a surge of defensiveness, but she'd merely smiled and changed the subject. It was easier than trying to explain something that even she didn't fully understand. Yet, the small, persistent criticisms, like water dripping on a stone, began to wear at her. She found herself looking over her shoulder more often as she approached the park, a flicker of self-consciousness dimming the simple joy of her routine. She started varying her time slightly, hoping to avoid the joggers or the early morning dog walkers. It was a small compromise, but it felt like a betrayal of the straightforwardness that had defined her interactions with Mr. Henderson. One blustery April morning, about a month before the wedding, she found Mr. Henderson looking particularly frail. A harsh cough racked his thin frame, and his face was pale beneath the grime. Amelia's heart ached. Along with his usual breakfast, She'd brought a small, new blanket and a pair of warm socks. She placed them beside the bag, her hand hesitating for a moment before she gently touched his arm. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Please take these. It's still so cold in the mornings." He looked at the blanket, then at her, his eyes, usually so guarded, holding a flicker of something unreadable. For the first time in 7 years, he spoke more than a single syllable. "Thank you, child," he rasped, his voice gravelly from disuse. "You are too kind." The words, simple as they were, felt momentous. Amelia could only nod, a lump forming in her throat, before she turned and hurried away, her own eyes surprisingly moist. That brief exchange, that acknowledgement of her sustained effort, erased weeks of doubt and self-consciousness. It reaffirmed her belief in the simple power of human connection, a connection that transcended societal judgment and outward appearances. She resolved then that Mr. Henderson would be at her wedding. The thought was sudden, unexpected, yet it felt undeniably right. He was, in his own quiet way, a significant part of her life. How she would make it happen, she didn't yet know. But the seed was planted. Do you believe that true kindness persists even in the face of social pressure? Or do we all, at some point, bend to the expectations of others? Perhaps it's the acts performed when no one is watching, or when they are watching with disapproval, that reveal our truest character. The decision to invite Mr. Henderson to her wedding felt like a quiet act of defiance, a personal stand against the unspoken judgments she had faced. When she broached the subject with David, his initial reaction was one of surprise, quickly followed by concern. "Leah, are you sure? I mean, it's wonderful that you care for him, but a wedding, it's a formal event. Will he be comfortable? Will our guests?" His questions were valid, echoing the societal norms they both understood. Amelia took a deep breath. "David, for 7 years, he's been a constant in my life. A silent, dignified presence. This wedding is about celebrating love and the important people in our lives. And in his own way, he's important to me. It wouldn't feel right if he wasn't there, knowing he's just a few blocks away alone." She explained her plan. She would discreetly buy him a new suit, arrange for him to have a shower and a shave at a local community center that offered such services with dignity. She wouldn't pressure him, merely extend the invitation. David, seeing the quiet determination in her eyes, the same determination that had first drawn him to her, finally nodded. "Okay, Leah, if it means that much to you, we'll make it work. But we need to be prepared for some reactions." Amelia knew he was right. She steeled herself for potential awkwardness, for the raised eyebrows and whispered comments. But the image of Mr. Henderson, clean-shaven and in a respectable suit, sharing in her day, outweighed any social anxieties. The next morning, along with his breakfast, she tucked a carefully worded, handwritten note into the bag. It was a simple invitation, explaining the date and time, and offering her help with attire and transport if he wished to attend. She made no demands, expressed no expectations, simply extended the offer from her heart. For several days, there was no response. Mr. Henderson took the bag as usual, nodded his thanks, and the note remained unmentioned. Amelia began to think he would decline, perhaps finding the idea too overwhelming or inappropriate. She wouldn't blame him if he did. Then, one morning as she placed the bag down, he cleared his throat. "The wedding," he said, his voice still raspy but clearer than before. "I would be honored." Amelia's heart leaped. A wide smile spread across her face. "Oh, Mr. Henderson, I'm so glad." Over the next few weeks, in brief, quiet conversations, they made the arrangements. He was surprisingly amenable, his initial shyness giving way to a quiet sort of anticipation. Amelia bought a simple, dark suit, a crisp white shirt, and a conservative tie from a local department store, choosing sizes she guessed would fit his lean frame. She arranged with a friend who volunteered at a downtown outreach center for Mr. Henderson to use their facilities on the morning of the wedding. She even bought him a new pair of shoes, sturdy and polished. Each step felt like a small victory against the indifference he had faced for so long. Meanwhile, the subtle resistance from others continued. When David's mother learned of the invitation, her smile was strained. That's very progressive of you, Amelia. I do hope he behaves himself. Even her own maid of honor, her closest friend Sarah, had expressed reservations. Leah, I love your compassion, but are you sure this isn't a bit much? It's your wedding day. You don't want any distractions. Amelia found herself defending her decision more often than she'd anticipated. He's a person, Sarah, not a distraction, and he deserves to be treated with dignity. The effort it took to coordinate everything for Mr. Henderson, on top of the final wedding preparations, was considerable. There were moments when Amelia felt overwhelmed, when the societal anxieties whispered doubts in her ear. But then she would remember his quiet, "Thank you, child," or the flicker of anticipation in his eyes, and her resolve would harden. This was more than just an invitation. It was a statement about the kind of world she wanted to live in, the kind of person she wanted to be. She was not naive. She knew one act of kindness wouldn't magically solve Mr. Henderson's problems. But for one day, she could offer him a seat at the table, a place where he was not an outcast, but an honored guest. She was, in essence, extending the same courtesy, the same fundamental respect she had shown him every morning in the park, but on a grander, more public scale. It was a risk, certainly, but some risks, she was beginning to understand, were essential if one was to live a life of genuine meaning. The reactions of others, the whispers and stares, would be a small price to pay for upholding her own values. What is the true measure of compassion? Is it grand gestures or the quiet, consistent acts of kindness that often go unnoticed? And when faced with societal disapproval, how many of us would choose the harder path, the one that aligns with our heart rather than popular opinion? The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a perfect late spring day. Amelia's apartment buzzed with activity, bridesmaids chattering, the scent of hairspray mingling with coffee, her mother fussing over her veil. Amidst it all, Amelia felt a calm she hadn't anticipated. She had done all she could. Her friend Mark had picked up Mr. Henderson early that morning and taken him to the outreach center. Mark had reported back that Mr. Henderson was quiet but cooperative, and that the transformation, even just with a shower and a shave, was remarkable. Amelia had left the new suit and shoes with Mark, along with a small, handwritten card simply saying, "Looking forward to celebrating with you." Amelia, as she stepped into her wedding dress, a classic ivory gown that shimmered subtly in the light, she caught her reflection. She looked like a bride, outwardly serene, but beneath the surface, a small knot of anxiety remained. How would Mr. Henderson be received? Would he feel comfortable, or would the stares of strangers make him regret accepting? She pushed the worries aside. Today was about joy, about commitment, about love in all its forms. The ceremony was held in a beautifully restored historic building downtown, its tall windows flooding the main hall with natural light. Guests mingled, champagne flutes clinked, and a string quartet played softly. Amelia, escorted by her beaming father, walked down the aisle towards David, her heart full. As she stood at the altar, her gaze swept across the assembled faces, family, friends, colleagues. And then she saw him, seated discreetly in a pew towards the back, almost blending into the shadows, was Mr. Henderson. He was impeccably dressed in the dark suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his beard trimmed. He looked different, younger somehow. The deep lines of hardship on his face were still there, but they were softened, no longer the most prominent feature. What struck her most was his posture. He sat ramrod straight, his hands resting formally on his knees, an air of quiet dignity about him that was even more pronounced than usual. He caught her eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a hint of a smile touching his lips. In that moment, all of Amelia's anxieties vanished, replaced by a profound sense of rightness. He belonged here. Throughout the ceremony, Amelia was aware of him, not in a distracting way, but as a reassuring presence. She noticed a few curious glances cast in his direction, a whispered comment between two of David's aunts. But largely, he sat undisturbed, a silent observer. During the vows, as she pledged her life to David, she felt a tear escape and trace a path down her cheek. It was a tear of happiness, of love, but also, in a small way, a tear of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment, a journey that included 7 years of quiet mornings in Elmwood Park. The reception followed in an adjacent ballroom. As guests found their tables, Amelia made a point of going over to Mr. Henderson. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice warm, "I'm so happy you could make it. Are you comfortable?" He stood respectfully as she approached. "Miss Amelia," he corrected gently, his voice surprisingly steady. "It is I who should be thanking you. This is a kindness I haven't known in many years." His eyes, clear and direct, held a depth of emotion that touched her deeply. "Please," she said, "enjoy yourself. There's plenty of food and drink." He nodded. "I will. And congratulations to you and your young man. May you have many years of happiness." Amelia introduced him to David, who shook his hand firmly, his smile genuine. "It's an honor to finally meet you, sir," David said, his earlier reservations seemingly forgotten. "Amelia has told me, well, she cares a great deal." Mr. Henderson simply inclined his head, a quiet acknowledgement. As the evening progressed, Amelia watched him from afar. He ate sparingly, nursed a single glass of water, and mostly observed the festivities with a polite, reserved interest. He didn't attempt to mingle, nor did he look out of place. He simply was a figure of quiet integrity in a sea of celebration. The true test, Amelia knew, would be the reactions of others over a longer period. But for now, in the warm glow of the reception, with music playing and laughter filling the air, his presence felt not like a disruption, but a quiet testament to the expansive nature of kindness. It was a reminder that the circles of our lives can, and perhaps should, extend beyond the familiar and the comfortable. It begged the question, who defines who belongs at our celebrations, at our tables? Is it society, or the quiet dictates of our own hearts? The wedding reception was in full swing. Music pulsed, laughter echoed, and the dance floor was a swirl of colors and movement. Amelia, radiant in her gown, found herself momentarily disengaged from the happy chaos, her eyes instinctively searching for Mr. Henderson. He was still at his table near the back, nursing his water, a picture of quiet composure. She noticed that a few of David's younger cousins, initially curious, had drifted over and were attempting to engage him in conversation. To her surprise, Mr. Henderson was responding, his answers brief but polite, a faint smile even gracing his lips. It was more interaction than she had ever seen from him. Perhaps the warmth of the occasion, the sheer unexpectedness of being included, was coaxing him out of his shell, however slightly. David's mother, however, was a different story. Amelia saw her approach Mr. Henderson's table, her expression a mixture of forced politeness and thinly veiled scrutiny. Amelia tensed, preparing to intervene if necessary. Mrs. Albright, a formidable woman when she chose to be, clearly felt it her duty to assess this unusual guest. From across the room, Amelia couldn't hear their words, but she watched the body language. Mr. Henderson remained seated, inclining his head respectfully as Mrs. Albright spoke. He listened more than he talked, his demeanor deferential but not subservient. After a few minutes, much to Amelia's relief, Mrs. Albright nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Surprise? Grudging respect? And moved on. Later, David's mother sought Amelia out. "Well," she said, a note of bewilderment in her voice, "he's certainly quiet. Very proper. He wouldn't even tell me his first name. Just Mr. Henderson, ma'am." Amelia smiled. "That's just him, Mrs. Albright. He's a very private man. He did mention," David's mother continued, almost reluctantly, "that he knew your father. Briefly. Years ago. Something about a project they worked on." Amelia frowned. "My father? He never mentioned that to me." Her father had passed away when Amelia was in college, a kind, unassuming man who had worked as a civil engineer. It seemed unlikely, yet Mr. Henderson's disciplined nature, his quiet dignity, suddenly took on a new light. Could there be a connection she had never imagined? This small, unexpected piece of information added another layer to the mystery of the man she had befriended. It was a reminder that everyone carries a history, a tapestry of experiences often hidden from view. The first hint of the day's truly extraordinary turn came subtly. A few of the younger staff members at the venue began to whisper amongst themselves, their eyes darting towards the main entrance of the ballroom. A low murmur started to spread among the guests closest to the doors. Amelia, caught up in a dance with her father-in-law, initially paid it no mind. Then, the music seemed to falter, the chatter died down, and a hush fell over the room. Heads began to turn, not towards the bridal table, but towards the entrance. Amelia and David exchanged a puzzled glance. What was happening? The main ballroom doors, usually kept partially closed, were now being pushed wide open by the venue manager, his face a mask of astonishment and deference. Standing framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the brighter light of the lobby, were figures. Not just a few, but many. Tall, imposing figures standing in perfect, disciplined formation. As her eyes adjusted, Amelia's breath caught in her throat. They were Marines. Dozens of them. Perhaps, as her mind struggled to process the sight, even 100. All in full dress blues, their white hats pristine, their posture radiating an unshakable discipline and solemn purpose. They didn't speak, didn't move, simply stood there, a silent, formidable presence that instantly commanded the attention of every person in the room. The string quartet, which had resumed playing softly, trailed off into silence. Champagne glasses were lowered. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. The joyous, celebratory atmosphere of the wedding reception was suddenly charged with an entirely different kind of energy. Awe, respect, and a profound sense of unfolding significance. Who were they? Why were they here? And what did this astonishing, unexpected arrival have to do with her wedding, with her, or perhaps with the quiet, unassuming man sitting at the back of the room? The questions hung in the air, unspoken but palpable, as every eye in the room fixed on the silent assembly of Marines. Standing in the doorway of the small overflow room were 5 men. They were not in academy uniforms, nor did they look like late-arriving parents. These men radiated an entirely different kind of authority, a quiet intensity that was almost palpable. They were dressed in dark, well-fitting civilian attire, but their bearing, the way they scanned the room with quick, economical movements, spoke of a discipline far removed from academic life. One of them, a tall, powerfully built man with strikingly keen blue eyes and silvering hair at his temples, met Marcus's gaze. There was a flicker of recognition, then a slow, respectful nod. Marcus frowned, his mind racing. Did he know this man? Before he could place him, the man spoke, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Johnson?" he asked, the title delivered with a precision that sent a shiver down Marcus's spine. No one had called him by his full rank with that kind of ingrained respect in years. Marcus rose slowly, a sense of unreality washing over him. "Yes." The tall man approached, the other 4 fanning out slightly, a subtle but unmistakable protective formation. "Commander Alex Mason, SEAL Team 3, retired," the man said, extending his hand. "It's an honor, Gunny. We heard you were having a little difficulty gaining access." The other men introduced themselves with similar quiet professionalism. A lieutenant commander, 2 senior chiefs, a chief petty officer. All retired SEALs. Marcus shook Mason's hand, his mind reeling. "SEALs? Here? How do they even know?" "Commander Mason," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. I don't understand." "How?" Mason smiled, a brief, understanding expression. "Let's just say the military community is smaller than you think, Gunny. And word travels fast when one of our own is being disrespected, especially a legend like yourself." "Legend?" Marcus felt a flush creep up his neck. He had always considered himself just a Marine doing his job. "We understand your son, Ethan, is the valedictorian," Mason continued. "A fine achievement. He deserves to have his father witness it properly, not from an overflow room." He turned to the other SEALs. "Gentlemen, I believe it's time we rectified a significant oversight in Thornton Academy's hospitality." Without another word, Commander Mason turned and strode towards the doors leading into the main auditorium, the other SEALs falling in step behind him. They moved with a fluid, purposeful grace that was utterly captivating. Marcus, caught between astonishment and a dawning, incredulous hope, found himself following them, Sergeant Davies and the few other occupants of the overflow room trailing behind, wide-eyed and silent. The scene that greeted them as Commander Mason pushed open the auditorium doors was one of utter, suspended animation. Dr. Abernathy was frozen mid-sentence at the podium, his mouth agape. Every head in the vast hall was turned towards the entrance, a sea of shocked, bewildered faces. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket smothering the usual buzz of a large gathering. The two guards, Miller and Henderson, who had been positioned just inside the main doors, looked as if they'd seen ghosts. Their faces were pale, their earlier arrogance completely shattered, replaced by a mixture of fear and disbelief as 5 imposing figures, followed by the very man they had barred, strode into the auditorium. Commander Mason didn't pause. He walked directly down the center aisle, his team flanking him, their progress tracked by hundreds of pairs of eyes. They moved with an unhurried, undeniable authority, parting the stunned crowd like a ship through water. The air crackled with unspoken questions. Who were these men? What was happening? And why was the man who had been denied entry now being escorted by figures who radiated such power? Ethan, on stage, saw his father enter, and his jaw dropped. He saw the men with him, their serious, determined expressions, and his confusion warred with a sudden, inexplicable surge of pride and relief. His father was here, and he had brought backup. The silence in the auditorium was so profound that the soft, measured tread of the SEAL's shoes on the carpeted aisle seemed to echo. Commander Mason and his team didn't stop until they reached the front rows, the area reserved for VIPs and families of honor students, the very section Marcus had been denied access to. With a polite but firm gesture, Commander Mason indicated 2 now empty seats in the front row. One of the SEALs leaned over and spoke quietly to the couple occupying the adjacent seats, who immediately, and with wide-eyed deference, made space. "Gunny," Commander Mason said, turning to Marcus, his voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Your seat, I believe." Marcus hesitated for a split second, the sheer audacity of the moment, the unexpectedness of this powerful intervention, almost overwhelming him. Then, thinking of Ethan, thinking of the dignity these men were so unexpectedly restoring, he straightened his shoulders and took the offered seat. The 4 remaining SEALs didn't sit. Instead, they positioned themselves discreetly, but visibly at the ends of the front rows and along the side aisles, standing at ease, but exuding an unmistakable aura of vigilance. They weren't security, they were an honor guard, a silent testament to the man they had just escorted to his rightful place. Dr. Abernathy, still at the podium, finally found his voice, though with several shades less confident than before. Ladies and gentlemen," he stammered, "it seems we have some distinguished late arrivals. Please, let us resume." But no one was looking at Dr. Abernathy. All eyes were either on Marcus, now seated in the front row, or on the imposing figures of the SEALs. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Who was that man? Who were those men? The carefully orchestrated decorum of the Thornton Academy graduation had been utterly and irrevocably disrupted, not by an act of aggression, but by an act of profound, silent respect. Miller and Henderson, the 2 guards, had shrunk back against the auditorium wall near the entrance, their faces a mixture of terror and humiliation. Sergeant Davies, the security supervisor, stood near them, his expression a complex blend of frustration at his subordinates and a dawning understanding of the magnitude of their error. He knew, with a sinking feeling, that he would be answering some very difficult questions later. Commander Mason, seeing Marcus seated, gave a curt nod to Dr. Abernathy, a silent signal that the ceremony could, indeed, proceed. But the atmosphere in the room had changed. The earlier complacency was gone, replaced by an electric awareness, a sense that something extraordinary was happening. Ethan, on stage, could barely contain his emotions. He saw his father, seated in the front row, flanked by men who looked like they had stepped out of a movie. The shame and worry he had felt moments before were replaced by a swelling pride, so immense it almost choked him. He didn't understand everything, but he understood that these men were there for his dad, because his dad was someone important, someone respected. As the ceremony haltingly resumed, with various speakers attempting to regain the audience's attention, the presence of the SEALs and the story of Marcus's initial exclusion began to circulate in hushed tones. Parents leaned over to whisper to each other, piecing together fragments of information, their expressions shifting from curiosity to indignation on Marcus's behalf, and then to awe. When it was finally Ethan's turn to deliver his valedictory address, he walked to the podium with a newfound confidence. He looked out at the sea of faces, his gaze finding his father's. Marcus met his eyes, a small, proud smile on his lips, a look that conveyed a world of love and encouragement. Ethan took a deep breath. He had a prepared speech, one filled with the usual platitudes and thanks. But in that moment, looking at his father, at the silent, formidable man who stood as a testament to his father's hidden worth, Ethan knew he had to say something more. He put his prepared notes aside. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed faculty, proud parents, and fellow graduates, he began, his voice clear and strong, resonating through the now utterly silent auditorium. Today is a day of celebration, a day to look back on our achievements and forward to our futures. And I had a speech prepared for that. But something happened today, something that reminded me of what truly matters beyond academics, beyond accolades. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the audience before returning to his father. It reminded me that true honor isn't always found in the spotlight or in grand titles. Sometimes it's found in quiet dignity, in steadfast service, in sacrifices made silently, without expectation of reward. Sometimes the greatest among us are those who walk humbly, their true worth known only to a few, or perhaps to none at all, until circumstances reveal it. The SEALs stood impassively, but Marcus saw Commander Mason give a barely perceptible nod of approval. Ethan continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction. My father, Master Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Johnson of the United States Marine Corps, retired, he said, his eyes shining with pride as he looked directly at Marcus, taught me everything I know about perseverance, about integrity, about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when you're standing alone. He taught me that character is what you do when no one is watching, and that true strength isn't about how loudly you shout, but about how steadfastly you endure. A ripple of applause started, soft at first, then growing in volume, a spontaneous acknowledgement not just of Ethan's words, but of the man who had inspired them. Marcus felt a warmth spread through him, a pride so intense it almost brought tears to his eyes. This was his son, his boy, standing before hundreds, speaking with such eloquence and courage. Today, Ethan went on, his voice now thick with emotion, my father faced an obstacle trying to be here. He was met with disrespect, with a refusal to acknowledge who he is, simply because he didn't fit someone else's preconceived notion of importance. He, a man who has given more to this country than most of us can ever imagine, was made to feel unwelcome at his own son's graduation. The applause died down, replaced by a stunned, uncomfortable silence as the implications of Ethan's words sank in. Many in the audience exchanged uneasy glances, some looking towards the back where Miller and Henderson were now, trying to make themselves invisible. Dr. Abernathy shifted uncomfortably in his seat on stage. But my father, Ethan declared, his voice ringing with filial love and fierce loyalty, is not defined by how others choose to see him or by the indignities they may try to inflict. He is defined by his actions, by his service, by the quiet honor he carries within him every single day. And today, some of his brothers in arms, men of similar valor and integrity, made sure that honor was recognized. He gestured towards Commander Mason and the other SEALs. These gentlemen, true American heroes themselves, sought an injustice, and they acted. They didn't do it for show. or for thanks. They did it because it was the right thing to do. They did it because they understand the bonds of service, the meaning of respect, the debt we owe to those who have protected us. The applause that erupted this time was thunderous, a wave of sound that washed over the auditorium, directed at Ethan, at Marcus, and at the 5 silent figures who stood as sentinels of honor. Commander Mason allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. This was better than any formal reprimand to the school. This was public acknowledgement from the heart of the very family that had been wronged. Ethan waited for the applause to subside, his composure remarkable. So, as we, the graduating class of Thornton Academy, prepare to go out into the world, he concluded, his voice resonating with a maturity beyond his years, I hope we carry with us not just the knowledge we've gained in these halls, but also the lesson that was so powerfully demonstrated here today. The lesson of humility, of courage, of respect for all, regardless of their station or appearance, and the understanding that true leadership, true heroism, often wears the most unassuming disguise. Thank you. And thank you, Dad. This is for you. He looked at Marcus, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. Marcus could no longer hold back the tears. They streamed freely down his face, tears of pride, of relief, of overwhelming love for his son, and for the unexpected brotherhood that had come to his aid. The standing ovation that followed Ethan's speech was long and heartfelt. It was clear that his words, and the dramatic events that had preceded them, had struck a profound chord. Dr. Abernathy, when he finally regained the podium to continue the ceremony, looked visibly chastened. His subsequent remarks were notably more humble, his platitudes infused with a newfound sincerity. The rest of the graduation ceremony proceeded, but the undercurrent of what had transpired remained. The distribution of diplomas, the turning of tassels, all took place under the watchful, respectful gaze of the 5 retired SEALs, a constant reminder of the deeper values that had been so powerfully asserted. The air in Thornton Academy's auditorium was forever changed. After the ceremony concluded and the graduates jubilantly tossed their caps in the air, a throng of well-wishers surrounded Ethan. But his first move was toward his father. He pushed through the crowd and embraced Marcus in a fierce hug. Dad, I was so worried. I didn't know what happened. And then, who were those men? Marcus hugged him back, his heart overflowing. Those men, Ethan, he said, his voice thick with emotion, are heroes, true brothers. And they came because sometimes even old Marines need a little help from their friends in the Navy. Commander Mason and his team approached, their expressions now relaxed, even smiling. Ethan, Commander Mason said, extending his hand, that was one hell of a speech. Your father has every right to be proud. And so do we. Ethan shook his hand, then the hands of the other SEALs, his eyes wide with admiration. Thank you, sir. Thank you all. For what you did for my dad. For being here. It was our honor, son, one of QC's senior chiefs said, his voice gruff but kind. Your father is a legend in the community. We don't take kindly to legends being disrespected. Dr. Abernathy, along with a flustered-looking chairman of the school board, made their way over to Marcus, their faces etched with deep contrition. Master Gunnery Sergeant Johnson, Dr. Abernathy began, his voice dripping with newfound respect. Please accept my sincerest, most profound apologies for the egregious error that occurred at the entrance this morning. There is no excuse. It was an unacceptable failure on our part, and I assure you, it will be addressed with the utmost seriousness. Those guards, Doctor, Marcus interrupted gently but firmly, what's done is done. My primary concern was being here for my son. Thanks to these gentlemen, he gestured to the SEALs, that was achieved. Let's focus on celebrating these young graduates today. His magnanimity seemed to shame Dr. Abernathy even further. Of course. But please allow the Academy to host a small private reception for you, your son, and your esteemed guests. It's the very least we can do. Marcus glanced at Commander Mason, who gave a slight nod. That will be very gracious, Doctor. Thank you. The small reception was hastily arranged in the headmaster's private dining room. Miller and Henderson, the 2 guards, were conspicuously absent from their posts, and word quickly spread that they had been summarily dismissed. Sergeant Davies, the security supervisor, was there, and he approached Marcus with a look of deep regret. "Gunny, I'm truly sorry. I should have handled it better. I should have overridden them. Immediately. No excuses." Marcus shook his hand. "You did what you could in the circumstances, Davies. Lesson learned for everyone, I imagine." At the reception, Ethan, still buzzing with excitement, had a chance to talk more with the SEALs. He listened, rapt, as they shared a few carefully chosen, sanitized anecdotes about their service, always deflecting praise and often subtly highlighting the kind of quiet professionalism and courage his father embodied. They didn't speak of Marcus's specific combat exploits. Those were not stories for a celebratory occasion, and Marcus himself would never have countenanced it. But they spoke of the brotherhood, the shared values, the unspoken code that bound them together. Marcus watched his son, seeing the awe in his eyes, and felt a quiet satisfaction. Perhaps this unexpected turn of events, as humiliating as its beginning had been, had ultimately given Ethan an even deeper understanding of the world his father came from, of the true meaning of service and sacrifice. Before the SEALs departed, Commander Mason drew Marcus aside. "Gunny," he said, "there's a network of us. Vets from all branches. We look out for each other. You're not alone. If you ever need anything at all." He pressed a card into Marcus's hand. "That's my personal number, day or night." "Commander, Alex," Marcus said, using his first name for the first time, "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary, Gunny. Just an honor to finally meet you in person. Your reputation precedes you. Stay strong." With firm handshakes and mutual respect, the 5 SEALs departed, leaving as quietly and professionally as they had arrived. Their intervention had been swift, decisive, and profoundly impactful, a ripple of justice and honor spreading outwards from a single act of disrespect. The story of Ethan Johnson's graduation, of the 2 guards who tried to bar his heroic father, and of the 5 SEALs who silenced the room, became a legend at Thornton Academy and in the wider community. It served as a stark lesson for the school administration, which implemented new training protocols for all its staff, emphasizing respect, cultural sensitivity, and proper verification procedures. The ripples of that graduation day extended far beyond Thornton Academy. Local news outlets picked up on the story, though Marcus, with his characteristic humility, declined all requests for interviews, insisting the focus remain on his son's achievement and the quiet professionalism of the men who had come to his aid. The narrative, however, took on a life of its own, shared widely on social media and within veteran communities, often under headlines like "Justice for a Hero Marine" or "SEALs Stand Up for a Brother." It became a touchstone, a modern parable about respect, hidden heroism, and the enduring bonds of military service. For Marcus, life returned to its quiet rhythm, but with a subtle, significant shift. The incident, though initially painful, had inadvertently brought a part of his past, a part of himself he had long kept guarded, into the light. It had reconnected him with a community he hadn't realized he still belonged to so deeply. He kept Commander Mason's card in his wallet, a tangible reminder that he wasn't as alone as he sometimes felt. Ethan, profoundly influenced by the day's events, found his valedictory aspirations taking on a new dimension. He had always planned to study engineering, but now he felt a pull towards public service, perhaps even the military, though Marcus never pressured him, insisting only that Ethan follow his own heart and conscience. Their father-son bond, already strong, deepened further. Ethan had always respected his father, but now that respect was mingled with a profound awe for the quiet hero who had raised him. He started asking more questions about Marcus's time in the Corps, not about combat, but about the camaraderie, the leadership, the values. Marcus, in turn, began to share a little more, finding a catharsis in articulating experiences he had long held silent. The gift Marcus had brought for Ethan, a vintage compass engraved with the Marine Corps motto Semper Fidelis, and the words "to my son, my true north," took on an even greater significance. When Ethan finally opened it later that evening, his eyes welled up. "Always faithful, Dad," he whispered, understanding the layers of meaning in that simple phrase more deeply than ever before. The two guards, Miller and Henderson, faced the immediate consequence of their actions with their dismissal. Their moment of petty tyranny had cost them their jobs and earned them a notoriety they would likely carry for a long time. It was a harsh lesson in the abuse of power and the importance of treating every individual with basic human dignity. Sergeant Davies, the security supervisor, implemented new, more robust training for his team, using the incident as a case study in what not to do. He made it a point to personally oversee security at all major school events thereafter, ensuring that every guest list was meticulously checked and that his staff understood the importance of courteous and respectful interaction. Dr. Abernathy and the Thornton Academy Board, deeply embarrassed by the incident, established a new scholarship fund in honor of Master Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Johnson, designated for the children of veterans, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds. It was a significant gesture, a way of making institutional amends and fostering a more inclusive and respectful environment. Marcus, when informed, was humbled and quietly pleased, accepting it not for himself, but for future generations who might benefit. He even agreed to sit on the selection committee, offering his wisdom and experience. The story served as a potent reminder to the wider community as well. It sparked conversations about the often invisible sacrifices of veterans, the challenges they face reintegrating into civilian life, and the pervasive, subtle biases that can still exist. It highlighted the fact that heroism doesn't always come with a flashy uniform or public accolades. Sometimes, it walks quietly among us in the guise of an ordinary man in a simple suit, just trying to see his son graduate. And it underscored the powerful, unspoken code of the military brotherhood, that they will, when called upon, move heaven and earth to stand by one of their own, especially when that individual embodies the highest ideals of their service. Marcus Johnson never sought the spotlight, and he faded back into his quiet life after the graduation. But he was no longer just an anonymous retired Marine. He was a symbol, a reminder of quiet strength, enduring dignity, and the profound respect that is due to all who have served. And sometimes, when the ache in his knee was particularly bad, or when he looked at the compass he had given Ethan, he would remember the sight of 5 Navy SEALs silencing a room, not with shouts or weapons, but with the sheer, undeniable power of their respect for a brother. And he would smile. Justice sometimes has a way of arriving in the most unexpected and most impressive of uniforms. If you believe that true honor deserves to be recognized and that the bonds of brotherhood are unbreakable, type respect in the comments below. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, where we ensure that the quiet heroes among us are never forgotten and their stories of courage and integrity are always brought to light.